So good day, this is Doc Nigs Morales. So now we are in the chapter 5, design and planning phase. So our learning objectives for today is to explain the main characteristics of principal research design used in healthcare research. Second is discuss the importance of identifying the population. Third is identify the different techniques used to select samples. Fourth is explore the effectiveness of a research instrument through sampling, and last, familiarize with other components of research methodology. So what is research design? Research design is an overall plan or a blueprint created by the researcher to answer the research question, guides the researcher in the conducting of the study. So it's like a map. So if you want to go to a vacation, you should have your guide map and you plan your itinerary before going to your destination. So that's a research design. So it should be properly planned and it uh, should be based on your objectives. Okay. So research design, how often data will be collected? You should ask yourself as a researcher, if it's a qualitative research, what will you use? What data would you gather? Is it a video? Is it a questionnaire types or comparison? Where the study will take place and minimizing bias. So where the study will take place, because you should plan accordingly. Because if you have allotted a limited time, so if you want to finish your study in 6 months time, would you rather limit your sample from regional level to a city level? So that's it. And minimizing bias. So in planning stage, we, we remove biases. So how to select a method? First is describe the research design and make your sampling plan, methods of data collection and specific instrument, study procedure, is it ethically safeguard, and analytic procedure and methods. So describe the research design. First, you should determine, in the past lecture, you should determine what type of research is it. Is it qualitative or quantitative? So you should be clear on that topic or concept. Then sampling plan, because in different research methodology, there's different samples. No? In qualitative research, you may have 10 or less respondents because you have saturated data. Not like in quantitative research, you should have a sample size that would generalize your recommendation or results of your study. Methods of data collection and specific instrument. In quantitative research, it's more on the survey or the questionnaires. And data collection, it's more on giving of surveys and returning it to the researcher for tabulation and analysis. However, in qualitative research, thus planning is very important because in a qualitative research, you should have a lot of time to conduct your FGDs or your one-on-one interview, and you will have follow-up interviews or succeeding interviews after that. Your specific instrument is interviews, and your materials should be your recorder or your even your cell phones. No? Study procedure. So in the methodology and design, you should have that framework in mind. How will you conduct the study? And is it ethically sound? It should be based on the ethical principles that we have discussed already. Analytic procedure and methods. Here in chapter 5, or in the design and planning phase, you should also discuss how will you analyze your data. Is it statistical analysis, or is it narrative or thematic analysis? Identifies the procedures by which the study population will be selected. It includes the subjects, the data collection, and data analysis. We have already discussed this. Major components of research design. So we have the research setting, the sample and method selection, the type of data to be collected, and instrument for data collection. In research setting, it's not only the local, it is how you will plan your research, how will you will go through the data process, the data collection to data process, and the other variables such as what's the demographic profile, what is the local of the study. It should be clear on your research design. And sample and method of selection. So again, go back to your research problem. If it's COVID-19 live experiences of healthcare providers, so what are the sample? It's more on specific. You will have less than 10 if you have saturation of data. And method selection is more on the interviews and um, focus group discussion. In type of data to be collected, instrument for data collection, let's go to quantitative research. Type of data is more on the numerical data based on the tabulation of your returned and validated questionnaires. And your instrument should be standardized, and your instrument should be pilot tested and checked for validity. Other components is of research design is strategies to control extraneous variable, because some of the researches have been affected by the external variables such as COVID-19 live experiences, or what are the healthcare practices based on the pandemic. In times of pandemic, the external factors is the culture. So what are the culture in Batangas? What's the culture in northern part of the Philippines? So for us to control that variable, so we use this research design and planning for us to trim down what's the specific research question you want to answer. Description of tools and statistical treatment of data. In the research design, it should be clear what will you use to gather data. Is it a paper and pencil test? Is it a Google form or a web-based form? And if it's qualitative research, do you have interview guide? If it's photo voice, would it be the respondents will give you the picture and they will narrate? So it should be clear on your research design and planning. The purpose of research design is for us to provide maximum control over the extraneous variables and other phenomena that can influence the results of the study and affects its validity. I've already mentioned to you all that there are variables that cannot be controlled by the researcher. Thus, you limit them. No? You limit them through setting up your research and research setting and setting up your research design. So you will place there your limitation of the study. The three major types of quantitative research design, we have experimental, we have a quasi-experimental, and we have the non-experimental. So for the experimental, uh, this is the strongest test in the scientific method. We have two groups are formed. We have the control group and we have the experimental group. The control group, there's no manipulation. In experimental group, it represents the group which one variable is altered. So for randomized experiment or true experiment, if performance of control and experiment group are measured before and after experiment and when random assignment is used. So there are four characteristics of a true experimental research. We have manipulation. So the independent variable will be manipulated or altered. We have the control. So the control, there's one group that will not subject to experiment. Then we have randomization. All of them have equal chance of selection. And last is validity, where measurement of the effects of independent variable and dependent variable before and after. So we have the pre-test and post. So we have discussed already manipulation, the control, the randomization, the random selection, and the validity. Gives valid objective answers to all research questions, controls extraneous variable, and eliminates biases to ensure its validity. We have the two validity. We have the internal validity and we have external validity. It's an extent which it's possible to make an inference that change dependent can be truly be attributed to the dependent variable. In external validity, the degree which study results can be generalized to other setting and samples to generalizability of the findings and other sample. Okay. So quasi-experimental, it involves the manipulation of independent variable but may lack one or two properties of true experiment, often lacks of comparison or randomization to treatment. Subjects are not randomized assigned, they are randomized selected or sampled. So for our non-experimental, does not use manipulation. Subjects are neither randomly assigned, generally considered the weakest in establishing internal validity, cause and effect relationship of the independent variable and the dependent variable. Under the non-experimental, we have the descriptive research and the correlation research. The description of descriptive studies summarizes the status of phenomenon observed within natural environment and without any manipulation of the independent variable. So in descriptive studies, it's more on you want to explore the phenomenon. You want to know more about the phenomenon, such as in the COVID-19 pandemic. What do you want to know about COVID-19? That's it. So you want to know more. You want to explore. Is there a difference in why between people in the population with X characteristics and those who do not have X characteristics? We have types of descriptive design. We have the typical descriptive. It explores and explains phenomenon. Comparative design, it compares two or more groups or occurs naturally in a setting or explores for the differences. So comparative analysis of gender or healthcare practices of urban and rural areas in times of pandemic. So that's comparative analysis. What the conclusion is urban areas are more compliant with sanitation practices or hand hygiene practices than our rural areas, or is it other way around? Cross-sectional descriptive design is examine subject at a given point in time after the research design is completed and then gathers data on event occurring at the present time. So cross-sectional descriptive design is you have 5 to 10 months and within that month you've done your research. You're doing your research. In descriptive longitudinal design, the studies a sample individual over time to examine patterns of growth changes or trends across time. So, in longitudinal design, you do some retroactive or proactive research. No? You want to know the patterns, you want to know the trends of time. So under the descriptive longitudinal, we have the retrospective. So in the past, we have prospective. We project through the future. We predict. Correlational examines relationship among variables but does not involve manipulation or control. Also referred as ex post facto research. Attempts to understand the relationship among phenomena as they naturally occur without any intervention. Okay, so these are the examples. Problem statement format. Is there in correlational statement? Is there a correlation between X and Y in the population? If there's a relationship between anxiety levels and test performance among graduating nursing students. Is there a relationship between eating fast food and obesity among graduating nursing students? In qualitative design, it's elastic, flexible, and concerned with subjective meaning of one's experience. Focus on insight, perception of individuals of the phenomenon under investigation, such as lived experiences of COVID-19 survivors. So, it is concerned with the experiences of the subject and the meaning of that experiences. So, their perception, their you want to explore more through what? Narrations, observations, and even photos. These are the different types of qualitative research studies. We have the phenomenology, ethnography, grounded theory, historical research, case study, and narrative analysis. So in phenomenological research, it's focused on lived experiences, discovering the meaning of people life experiences, giving perception of particular phenomenon. Example, people suffering from chronic illnesses, stress, or those who have lost their loved ones. So in times of disaster, in times of emergencies, what are their perception? What are their deeper meaning of that situation? That is phenomenological research. For the main data source of phenomenological research is in-depth conversation. So in conducting a phenomenological research, you have a interview guide. It's 1 to 5 question that is an open-ended question. It's a primer for a more deeper conversation, and you will do your probing. So steps in phenomenological study: first, you do your bracketing, no? You do your narration, you verbatim, so you type it, you listen, you type it, and you re-listen or listen more. Then you bracket it based on the emerging same words. Then in tweeting, you do your analysis, no? What are the same thoughts? Then again, you read it, you analyze it, and you describe it with associated meaning and your themes, emerging themes. So focus on gaining insights and understanding the events. So the title is more on lived experiences. It examines human experiences through description by the people involved. Releases expectation biases prior to doing research. Bracketing, you remove biases. If you're a nurse and you will conduct a qualitative research regarding illness or death and dying, you should remove all of your preconceived ideas. So for your analysis not to be tainted or being dragged by your knowledge. The end purpose is to determine the themes and patterns and behaviors. Ethnographic research is focused on culture, labor-intensive endeavor requiring long periods of stay in the field to describe and interpret cultural behavior to understand the views of their world. such as if you want ethnography or ethnographic research of Mangyan community or Badiao community. So you're not only doing a interview, but you will be immersed on their culture, and on that point you will understand deeper their way of life. So aspects of information is cultural behavior, cultural artifacts, and even the speech or language they use. It's rich and holistic description of culture, access, health, beliefs, and practices. So the superstitious beliefs, the use of herbal medicine, understanding behavior affecting health and illness. So why are they not seeking help to the lowlands? So why they are with the side of nature as a healer? So in ethnographic research, you will understand it because we live by or we live with our indigenous people. Data sources is it varies. It cuts across different modalities of research instruments such as observation, in-depth interview, charts, records, even photography, diaries, and letters. The end purpose of ethnographic studies is to develop cultural theories, and the method is the participant observation and interviews with key informants. Okay, so in grounded theory research is focusing on the development and evolution of social experiences, study of social processes, social structure, evolution of social experiences, psychological stages and phases that characterize a particular event or episode. Features is data collection, data analysis, sampling of data. So the source of data is observation, in-depth interviews, and existing documents. In grounded theory, it is some like qualitative research or phenomenological research, but more intense. So because everything's emerge on your analysis, in the thematic analysis, you will question it again. You will ask someone to validate it until you do not have any question in your mind anymore. So thus, in grounded theory, your end product is your own theory. Okay? So like if you want to do grounded theory in coping in pandemic or coping in COVID-19 healthcare emergency, so your grounded theory will explain how an individual would cope. Is it the same as the adaptation theory of Sister Calista Roy, or it is another form of adaptation theory? Right? So exciting. Study of social processes, I've discussed already. So in historical research, focusing on the past, no? So yung mga ayaw na nating balikan, so now we'll do retrogressive analysis. Attempts to answer questions about causes, effects, or trends related to past events, issues, or conditions that may explain current behavioral practices. So in historical research, it's more on chart review. It's more on narrative analysis based on narrations of our primary sources. Critical evaluation, systematic collection, interpretation of historical evidence with the end goal of discovering new knowledge based on the past. Forms of historical research. We have social histories, biographical histories, intellectual histories. So types of evaluation, we have external criticism, evaluates the authenticity of the data. Internal criticism evaluates the worth of data, focusing on the truth and accuracy of the content of the evidence. So as you observe, there are artifacts that had been questioned. There are artifacts that should need validation. So that's external criticism. In internal criticism, you evaluate the content of that artifact. Okay. So source of data in historical research, again, it's written records, letters, diaries, newspapers, documents, photographs, films, physical remains, and sometimes interviews or recorded interviews. Case studies. Case studies is focusing on a single case or entity, such as our case studies in our clinical exposure. So in-depth investigation for a single entity or social unit, the individual, family, group, or institution, organization, community in which the core of inquiry is the case itself, such as you've done your family diagnosis, you've done the community diagnosis. It is under the case studies. The greatest strength is its depth of investigation, which makes available an abundance of intimate knowledge of a person's condition, thoughts, feelings, and behavior. Major criticism is difficulty of attaining generalizability because collected data and evidence pertain only to a single entity. Because if you have case study of cancer of the lungs, so it is only focused on that specific case. But if there's cancer of the lungs with diabetes, so you cannot say that you have the same suggestion or recommendation on the lung cancer, because the lung cancer with diabetes has different disease course. Okay, so that's the problem in studies. Narrative analysis is focusing on the story in the studies. In-depth investigation for a single entity or social unit, organization, community, which core inquiry is the case itself. Beliefs that make people that make sense of their world and communicate this meaning by constructing, reconstructing, and narrating stories. Three category of typology of narrative analysis. First set of models focus on the temporal order of events. Second set of models is focus on the structure and coherence of narratives. And third is focus on the cultural, social, and psychological context and function of the narrative. The five dimension of narrative approach. First is people organize significant events in terms of stories and make meaning out of the life experiences through telling of these stories. Second is time and plot are structural properties of narrative with events following sequences. So in the narrative analysis, you should know the background, when, how, where the narration had been written. No? Because in the time that's been written, it can be affected by different factors such as war, such as famine, such as disease. So for you to understand more the context of the narrative of the specific groups or population. Narrative have cultural context, which means that they do not occur by themselves. Yes, of course. So before you read the narrations or the excerpts, you should understand what's the culture, what's the background of this person, what is his or her beliefs, the norms. Narratives are relational with stories told to other people. Narratives have the power to shape human behavior and may be focused to produce moral story of how people are supposed to behave. So step 7 is developing protocols for interventions. In experimental research, researchers create independent variable. Participants need to be exposed to different treatment and conditions. What is research population? Universe or target population is aggregate of cases about which researcher would like to generalize. Population is the entire aggregation of cases which a researcher is interested. Accessible population is aggregator cases that conform to designated criteria and are accessible for the study. Okay, for our research population, we have parametric and non-parametric. Parametric refers to the total population or total universe being studied which can be assumed to be normal. However, the non-parametric refers to something less than the population. Total population is it's just part of the population. So as you can see based on the diagram, so let's have an example. So our universe is the nursing population or nursing. Then population, the universe is the target population. Then our population is nurses in the Philippines. And because it's accessible, however, we should get the sample because for us to have a feasible study, so we get only Batangas nurses. So that's our sample, population, and universe. Steps in developing an acceptable description of population. First, should have be clear about the study problem. So, in your title and research problem, you should be specific. No, what are your location? What is your intended population? And what delimits your study, or what's your scope and limitation? Next is who you want to study. That's very specific. Who? It's not only nurses. Is it student nurses? Is it professional nurses? What type of nurse? Is it psychiatric nurse, pediatric? You should specify your study population. Next is brainstorm with colleagues of who you want to study because there should have collaboration and brainstorming of based on the research problem, who is the most beneficial on conducting this study, who can benefit on your study. Then drop the population from the target and narrow down to accessible population. From the target population, nurses, you should narrow it down to accessible population. How can we say it's accessible? If you as a researcher can conduct the study where he or she resides. If you want the regional population or scope, um, I will ask the researcher, can you do it? If it's not, and the accessibility is the problem, thus we can limit it to a much more feasible population. Next is evaluate the tentative population. Again, let's go back to your objectives, your statement of the problem, and significance of the problem. And last, improve the population description to maintain clarity, precise, and thoroughness. The best method to use in obtaining representation sample is random selection. Random sampling is the best method to employ if the population is large. So random sampling is a sampling technique where all of the population has equal chance of being selected as your respondents. Sampling is a process of selecting cases to represent an entire population so that the inferences about the population can be made. A sample is drawn from the population and subject of research is a subset of the population. It's taken because of it's not feasible to the study and the whole population. And elements are the most basic unit about which data are collected. So Sampling frame is the list of all members of the population of interest which are chosen from the sample. Then we have sample variation, process by which sampling is done. So later we'll discuss different sampling techniques. Sampling design, sampling scheme that specifies the number of samples drawn from the population, the criteria of their selection, and the type of sampling method. The single most important characteristic of sample in quantitative research is representativeness. Strata is population consists of subpopulation, and stratum is mutually exclusive segment of the population defined by one or more characteristics, such as example, two strata equates gender, male or female. Three strata grouping, so group A to C. Purpose and advantages of sampling. Sampling makes possible the study of a large heterogeneous population. Sampling is for speed because if your study comprise a national scope, so you should have a representative of different nurses across the Philippines. However, if you're not if you're not if you will not observe sampling technique, so it will take time, no, all of the nurses, total population, I think it's not feasible. Thus sampling is for speed, sampling is for economy. Why? If you will do your survey in a pen and paper test or questionnaire, so it entails cost of printing and manpower to disseminate your questionnaire. Thus sampling is for economy, no, it's cost effective. Sampling is for accuracy. Yes, though the ideal is the total population of your intended respondent. However, sampling and based on the sampling size that can be computed by our statistician, it can be generalizable. Your results can be replicated, and we can assume that it can be true to all. Sampling saves the sources of data from being all consumed. So I've already discussed this, that sampling is cost effective. Sampling could help the researcher not to be burned out in doing the research. So as you can see, it's a relationship among population. There's elements. The element is students. So for us, for the researcher, it's element. What are the characteristic? Is nurses. Then the sample is 100 students. Sampling frame is registered list of currently enrolled nursing students, and the population is the whole students enrolled in the College of Nursing. Two kinds of bias. We have selection bias and response bias. In selection bias occurs when the result is either overrepresentation. Response bias, there's or underrepresentation. So we have 100 of total respondents, 70 are female, 25 are male. Therefore, females are overrepresented as compared to male nurses. So that's selection bias. Now we will go to our probability sampling. It involves random selection in choosing the subjects or elements. Randomization or random choice is the hallmark of probability sampling. We have two types of sampling design. We have the probability and non-probability sampling. In the probability sampling, it involves random selection of elements. The sample's proportion of the populations, such as sample is selected from the population by means of some systematic way in which every element of the population has chance to be included in the sample. However, in non-probability sampling, elements are selected by non-random methods. The sample is not a proportion of the population, and there is no system in selecting the sample. No guarantee that each element has chance of being included in the sample. Popular among researchers because of its convenience and economy use. So we have different types of random sampling. We have simple random sampling, stratified random sampling. In simple random sampling, all elements are enumerated and listed in sampling frame. The selection of sample is done by chance. Lottery draws or table of random numbers, roulette, are the best examples of this method. In the stratified random sampling, you group uh, the population by strata, then you subdivided the area section and random samples are taken from each, such as you group them based on the demographic profile, age, gender, then you randomly select them. Cluster or multi-stage sampling, the researcher selects random samples from larger or successively smaller units. It's more practical, particularly with large and widely dispersed population. A small sample is taken from various sections of the total population. Example is the studying the attitudes of nurses in Metro Manila towards their work. A small sample from each hospital will be taken. Systematic sampling, it's where you designate a number in each of your respondents or population. Then the researcher will decide if it's in the fifth number, so or if every 10th person in the list will be taken a sample. So we have types of non-probability sampling. We have the accidental or haphazard or convenient sampling. The researcher chooses subjects who are readily available, most convenient. It's an incidental sampling, the most commonly used sampling method, but the weakest form. Purposive or judgmental sampling is if the researcher has its own criteria and handpicked by the researcher because of the specific characteristics stipulated in the research design or the research study. Quota sampling, the research divides the population into two or more homogeneous strata or subpopulation in order to ensure the representative proportion of various strata in the sample, and then determine how many subjects are needed for each stratum. Procedurally similar to convenient sampling, but identification of the strata and the desired representation for each stratum. Snowball, network, or chain sampling. The researcher few subjects which meet the required characteristics. It is variant of the convenient sampling. Early sample members are asked for referral to others who meet the eligible criteria. Subjects who are difficult to identify, such as HIV positive and mentally challenged individuals. So based on my research in lived experiences of cancer patients, I've used convenient sampling because as a researcher, I'm also affiliated on the specific hospital setting that he or she currently admitted with a cancer and with ongoing chemotherapy. Convenient and snowball sampling because I've also asked them who can be a potential inclusion for our respondents of the research study. Consecutive sampling, recruiting all of the people from accessible population who meet the eligible criteria or over a specific time interval or specific sample size can be selected retrospectively or prospectively. Example, 20 pregnant clients with gestational diabetes within period of third trimester. So we have retrospective and perspective. In the quantitative study, we have longitudinal and we have the cross-sectional study. In longitudinal study, the follows the subject over a period of 6 months or more accurate study of changes that occur over time. So you will um, explore the trends and are there relationship between the length of if it's practice or intervention. Cross-sectional studies examines the subject at one point in time, less expensive and easier to conduct. So again, selecting a sample, eligibility criteria or inclusion criteria. So the criteria that specify the characteristics of population needed in the study. However, the exclusion criteria is the characteristics that are not necessary. Factor that affects eligibility criteria is the cost, the practical concerns, the subject ability to participate, and design consideration. Cost, because again, in conducting research, you should be mindful that it entails cost. Even the printing of your questionnaire, so it entails cost. Practical concern, um, it is for the respondents if it's convenient to him or her to be with you for 1 hour, if it's qualitative research, or is in the practicality side, is the researcher equipped with proper competencies and tools in conducting a specific research methodology, subjects ability to participate. So it should be observed, because if the the respondent is busy or preoccupied with other matters, thus you should remove them as a sample, because it may um, affect the analysis of your research. And design consideration. Qualitative research, in doing qualitative research, you will have a face-to-face interaction. And based on the sampling, there's differences, because in sampling technique for qualitative research is purposive, snowball, and convenient. Okay? So determination of sample size. So based on the Slovin's formula, so we have sampling from small and finite population of n, and small n may be obtained. So n, small n equals n over n plus ne2 sample. Recommended sample in qualitative research is 10 or fewer, because again, if you analyze simultaneously, you doing your data gathering and you analyze it as well, and you do saturation. If the data is saturated already, even you have only 2 or 3 respondents, if you're satisfied and it's saturated enough for you to explain the phenomenon. Okay. Ethnographic studies of 25 to 50K informats chosen purposefully, and grounded theory studies is 20 to 30 subjects. Sampling size selection. So in quantitative, use the largest sample, because the larger the sample, the higher the confidence level, and the lower the error of margin of error. In a qualitative studies, there's no criteria or rules for sample size. Quantitative studies use the power analysis to identify sample size, observe the principle of data saturation. So I've already discussed this. In the quantitative studies, consider important factor when having small size sample size: homogeneity, effect size, sensitivity, and accuracy of measurement and instruments. Then in qualitative, its sampling plan should be evaluated in terms of adequacy and appropriateness. Identification of sample, you use special codes time, event, and situation sampling, time sampling, event sampling, and situation sampling. Step 10 is specifying methods to measure variables. And last, developing methods to safeguard human and animal rights. So in this step 11, we will discuss the ethical principles that should be observed in conducting your study and how we as researcher can protect and observe these ethical principles for us not to harm our respondents and maintain their confidentiality, anonymity, and having that trust relationship with our respondents. Step 12 is reviewing and finalizing the research plan. Conduct pre-testing and a pilot study. Pre-testing and pilot study are the last of preliminary activities that precede data collection for research project. A pre-test serves as trial run of the instrument developed for testing the hypothesis. Pre-testing is a process of measuring effectiveness of the instrument or tools used to gather